Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about one of the strangest, dirtiest, and most deliberately hidden chapters of medieval history. What really happened inside nunneries? You've probably seen them in movies or paintings. Solemn women in black veils, their hands folded, eyes cast down, their lives devoted entirely to prayer and holiness. The convent, a sanctuary from the sins of the world, pure, untouchable, eternal. But here's the truth. Not all nunneries were places of quiet devotion. Some were riddled with scandal, corruption, and forbidden desire. These were closed communities of women, many of them forced into this life. And what happened when you locked hundreds of young people away from the outside world wasn't always saintly. There were affairs with priests sneaking through side doors, nuns running secret businesses, abbesses drunk on wine and power, even whispered accusations of witchcraft and possession when passions got out of control. Kind of wild, right? That a place designed to keep temptation out often became a breeding ground for it. Yet this side of history rarely makes it into school books. The church worked hard to cover up the worst of it, and even today, people prefer to imagine the convent as something untouchable and sacred. But behind stone walls, human nature doesn't disappear. It just finds new, sometimes shocking, ways to surface. Oh, and if you're enjoying these kinds of forbidden glimpses into history, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Always blows my mind how some of you are lying in bed at 2 a.m. with your headphones on, while others are sitting at a desk in the middle of the day, sneaking a little history break. Now get comfortable. Seriously, pull up that blanket, maybe dim the lights, and let the hum of the room around you fade. Because tonight, you're not in the 21st century anymore. You've slipped back into the 14th century, and the first bell of the convent is tolling at dawn. You open your eyes. The room around you is small, bare, and cold. The walls are stone, damp with moisture. Your bed is nothing but a straw mattress, stuffed into a wooden frame, crawling with lice that make you itch even in your sleep. A single wool blanket covers you, heavy and itchy, smelling faintly of mildew and sweat. The only furniture is a wooden cross nailed to the wall and a cracked clay pitcher for water. You stand shivering and pull on your habit, the rough wool rubbing against your skin, a far cry from silk or linen. Through the thin window slit you can see the mist rising in the courtyard. Hear the echo of footsteps as sisters hurry toward the chapel. Their sandals slap against the flagstones, their voices already low in morning chant. From the outside it looks serene, peaceful. But you already know that beneath this silence there's something else. You've seen the furtive looks exchanged in the cloisters. You've heard the whispers of letters hidden under altar cloths. You've smelled the wine smuggled in barrels meant for holy water. Because this is the unspoken truth. Life in a medieval nunnery wasn't just about prayer. It was about power. It was about survival. And it was about desires that refused to be buried, no matter how hard the church tried. So welcome. You've just woken up in a medieval convent. And by the time this night's story is done, you'll see that what really happened here would make even the most scandalous medieval tavern blush. If you imagine a medieval girl deciding one morning, I want to give my life to God, and joyfully skipping off to the convent. That's the fairy tale. The reality was far less romantic, and often far more brutal. Most women in medieval nunneries weren't there by choice. They were sent there, forced there, sometimes abandoned there like unwanted parcels. Why? Because daughters were expensive. In a world where marriages were arranged and dowries could ruin a family's fortune, sending a girl to the convent was cheaper than marrying her off. Families with too many daughters had to make a choice. Wed the eldest, maybe the second, but the rest straight to the cloister. Imagine being 12 years old, not even fully grown, and suddenly told your fate. One morning, your father sits you down. He tells you he's giving you to God. You'll never marry, never raise children, never leave those walls again. You'll wear wool until the day you die, and the most you can hope for is to rise high enough to boss around the younger girls who suffer the same fate. And it wasn't just about money. A daughter who disobeyed, who flirted too much, who shamed her family by being too outspoken or curious. Off to the convent she went. It was the medieval version of exile. Better to bury her behind cloister walls than risk gossip in the village. But here's the darker side no one likes to talk about. Sometimes women weren't sent. They were dumped, literally. Parents would abandon infants at convent doors, hoping the sisters would raise them. Some of those girls grew up never knowing another life, never even given the illusion of choice. The convent, in other words, was a prison built out of family desperation, economic necessity, and sometimes sheer cruelty. And it shaped the women inside. Many resented it. Some adapted. Others rebelled in ways that left their names written in scandalous court records that still survive. The church liked to pretend that every nun had chosen a higher calling, that she'd fallen in love with Christ and joyfully given herself to him. But the truth is, many of these women carried resentment like a hidden wound. Behind their chants and prayers, they dreamed of the lives they'd lost, or never had the chance to live. Lovers they might have had, children they would never raise, homes they would never see again. Think about that. Hundreds of women cut off from the world, many of them bitter and angry. And then ask yourself what happens when you take that much pent-up frustration, lock it behind stone walls, and pretend it doesn't exist. You don't have to imagine too hard. The records are filled with stories of convent scandals, nuns sneaking out to meet lovers, others disguising themselves as men to escape, abbesses using the convent's wealth for feasts and drink. In some nunneries, the veil of chastity was little more than a costume. The walls meant to contain holiness instead became the stage for hypocrisy. So no, medieval nunneries weren't filled with eager, saintly women embracing their destiny. They were filled with daughters sacrificed by their families, women punished into obedience, and children who never had a say at all. And behind that forced devotion, a storm of anger, longing, and rebellion that the church tried and failed to keep under wraps. So what was daily life really like once you crossed through those cloister doors? Forget the peaceful images of women walking serenely through herb gardens, hands clasped in prayer, chanting in angelic harmony. The reality was far rougher, dirtier, and often downright miserable. The day began early, painfully early. At the crack of dawn, sometimes before, the bell would toll. You'd be dragged from the thin comfort of your straw mattress, rubbing your eyes raw, scratching at lice bites, and shivering from the damp stone air. There was no easing into the day, no slow breakfast or warm drink. You went straight to the chapel, barefoot or in thin sandals, to chant prayers in unison with dozens of other tired voices. And then, more prayers. And more. Medieval convent life revolved around a rigid schedule called the Divine Office. 7 times a day, you were required to chant psalms, no matter if you were exhausted, sick or starving. Think about it. Hours upon hours of repetitive chanting, often in Latin that many of the nuns barely understood. Your voice cracked, your throat ached, your mind wandered, but you weren't allowed to stop. If you slipped, the sister next to you might tug your sleeve or whisper a correction. If you kept slipping, you risked punishment, extra fasting, kneeling for hours, or being forced to sleep on the cold floor as correction. Between prayers, the nuns worked hard. They cleaned the convent, scrubbing floors on hands and knees, laundering rough wool habits in freezing water, tending vegetable gardens, caring for the sick in the infirmary. Laundry alone was miserable. Imagine scrubbing piles of dirty linen by hand, wringing them out until your arms burned, then hanging them in a damp courtyard where the wind whipped your skin raw. And this wasn't just your laundry, it was for the entire community. Meals? Forget anything resembling comfort. Breakfast was rare. Lunch might be a chunk of coarse bread, a thin pottage of beans, maybe cabbage or leeks if the garden was kind. Meat was forbidden, except on special feast days. Wine, when it appeared, was watered down until it was barely more than sour juice. And the convent enforced fasting days, lots of them. You often went to bed hungry, your stomach growling as you prayed yourself into sleep. And hygiene? Let's be blunt, it was terrible. Baths were rare, sometimes only a few times a year. Water was cold, soap was harsh if it existed at all, and the smell inside the dormitories reflected it. Sweat, mildew, damp straw, unwashed bodies, lice and fleas thrived. For all the talk of spiritual purity, physical filth was everywhere. Yet beneath this strict, monotonous routine, temptation was always lurking. Some nuns secretly despised the endless hours of prayer. They whispered jokes during chants, snuck bites of food during fasts, or feigned illness to escape chores. Others pushed rebellion further, slipping out at night through secret doors, meeting priests or townsmen under cover of darkness, exchanging letters or gifts smuggled in under cloaks. Records survive of nuns caught in scandalous situations. 2 sisters discovered drunk on stolen wine, an abbess accused of hosting feasts with roasted meats while her community starved. Even tales of nuns caught in relationships with each other, punished with humiliating public penance. This was the hidden reality. Convent life was not some ethereal, holy experience. It was exhausting, dirty, hungry, monotonous, and full of women, human women, who often sought little escapes from their prison-like existence. And yet for many this was the only life they would ever know. Day after day, the same routine. Prayer, labour, hunger, sleep, repeat. No wonder some convents became breeding grounds for rebellion, scandal and desire. Because when you bury human instincts under stone and silence, they find cracks to crawl through. If you think convents were places of quiet holiness, think again. For every obedient nun who kept her head down, there was another who pushed back, sometimes so spectacularly that bishops and inquisitors were called in to clean up the mess. Medieval records, court documents, and even gossip-filled chronicles tell us that nunneries could be anything but holy. They were often dens of scandal, corruption, and rebellion, the kind of stories the church would have preferred no one remembered. Take, for example, the case of a 14th century convent in France where the abbess, the woman in charge, supposedly the spiritual mother of her community, was accused of keeping a secret lover. Not just any lover, but a priest who regularly visited the convent under cover of night. The sisters whispered that she would sneak out of evening prayers and vanish into her chambers until dawn. Eventually, the scandal grew so loud that the local bishop intervened. And yet, instead of punishing her severely, he looked the other way. Because she came from a powerful noble family whose donations funded half the diocese. Holiness, it turned out, was negotiable. Then there's the infamous story from Italy, where entire communities of nuns were caught feasting on meat and wine during Lent, openly defying the church's fasting rules. When inspectors arrived, They found tables laden with roasted birds, pastries dripping in honey, and barrels of wine drained nearly dry. These weren't just small infractions. This was open rebellion against one of the most sacred parts of the Christian calendar. And yet, the nuns laughed, mocking the inspectors, daring them to report what they saw. But the scandals weren't just about food or lovers. Some were darker. In 15th century Germany, records describe convents plagued by violence between the sisters themselves. Fist fights broke out in dormitories, women clawing at each other over rank or privileges. One document even notes a nun striking her abbess across the face with a candlestick during an argument about chores. Imagine the shock. Women sworn to chastity, humility, and obedience turning the cloister into a brawl. And then, of course, there were the sexual scandals, the ones whispered about but rarely written in detail. Visitors found nuns entertaining men disguised as pilgrims, smuggling them into their cells for the night. Others involved priests who abused their position as confessors, turning spiritual counselling into exploitation. Sometimes the scandals involved nuns with each other, forming close bonds that crossed into forbidden territory. The church labelled it unholy affection, a sin they punished harshly, often humiliating the women by shaving their heads or forcing them into public repentance. One of the most shocking cases comes from Spain in the late Middle Ages, where a convent was discovered to be functioning less like a house of prayer and more like a brothel. Wealthy patrons paid for the company of nuns, who were expected to provide hospitality in exchange for protection and gifts. The local authorities tried to shut it down, but the convent had powerful allies, and the scandal dragged on for years. All of this flies in the face of the church's official image of nunneries as pure, untouched spaces of devotion. The reality was far messier. These were institutions filled with human beings, trapped, frustrated, longing for something beyond the walls. And when you mix forced devotion, hunger, power struggles, and repression, scandals are inevitable. The church tried to control the narrative, to sweep these stories under the rug, but enough of them survived in dusty archives to paint a picture that's impossible to ignore. Medieval nunneries were just as full of sin, desire, and rebellion as the world outside their walls, sometimes even more so. When people think of medieval nunneries, they usually picture humble women in plain habits, eating scraps, living in silence, and spending their days in prayer. And while that was true for many poor convents, not all nunneries were places of suffering and simplicity. In fact, some of them became incredibly wealthy, and with wealth came corruption, greed, and hypocrisy that would make even the most jaded medieval peasant roll their eyes. The trick was noble dowries. A wealthy family who wanted to tuck away an unwanted daughter or avoid paying for her marriage could donate a hefty sum of land, silver, or livestock to a convent. Over time, these donations piled up. Some nunneries owned sprawling estates, rented farmland, collected taxes from peasants, and lived off the profits. Instead of scraping by on cabbage stew, these nuns dined on roasted meat, imported spices and fine wines, all behind the cloister walls. There are records of abbesses who dressed in silks and jewels, wearing golden rings under their veils. In one notorious case from 13th century France, an abbess was accused of riding around the countryside in a gilded carriage, escorted by servants, while her sisters at home ate from silver plates. Hardly the image of holy poverty. And money didn't just buy food and clothes, it bought influence. Rich convents became power players, their abbesses negotiating with kings, bishops, and merchants. Some abbesses even sat in councils alongside noblemen, their words carrying the weight of an aristocrat. The church tolerated it because the wealth kept flowing. After all, corruption at the top was always easier to ignore if the coffers stayed full. But inside those wealthy nunneries, hypocrisy reigned. The rule of St. Benedict demanded poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet many convents ignored it when it suited them. Nuns were caught sneaking sweets into their cells, hoarding coins, even keeping private pets despite bans. One German abbey was reported to have so many lapdogs that the barking drowned out the prayers. Luxury also opened the door to indulgence. With access to money, nuns could bribe guards or pay servants to fetch forbidden goods. Wine flowed freely in some cloisters, leading to drunkenness and disorder. In England, inspectors once found an entire convent so drunk they could barely stand for vespers. The report dripped with scandal, but the convent's noble patrons shielded them from punishment. And then there was the buying and selling of offices. Leadership roles inside nunneries, prioress, abbess, could be obtained not through holiness, but through bribes and political connections. A powerful family might pay off a bishop to secure the abbacy for their daughter, ensuring she enjoyed a cushy life of wealth and influence rather than a lifetime of scrubbing floors. It turned convents into career moves, not places of spiritual devotion. Of course, this corruption didn't go unnoticed. Poorer sisters, often from humble backgrounds, complained bitterly. Some wrote secret letters to bishops, exposing their abbesses for gluttony, theft, or lust. In one chilling story from Italy, a group of low-born nuns revolted, accusing their abbess of using convent funds to keep a lover. The abbess retaliated by locking them in the cellar for days without food. The church eventually investigated, but not before several women nearly died of starvation. The double life of nunneries, poverty and silence for the many, luxury and power for the few, reveals a system rotting from within. Outwardly, they preached holiness. Inwardly, they gorged themselves on wealth. For peasants who donated their last coins hoping for prayers, the hypocrisy must have felt like a bitter joke. This is the part of convent life polite history books prefer to ignore. The sheer greed and corruption that turned some nunneries into mini-palaces, where vows of poverty were mocked daily by women who had traded prayer for power. The vow of chastity was supposed to be unbreakable. A nun's body, in theory, belonged only to God. But the human heart and body don't always follow rules. Behind the convent walls, where women were cloistered away from men, desire didn't vanish. In fact, sometimes it burned brighter precisely because it was forbidden. There are records across Europe of nuns who secretly took lovers, and not always discreetly. Priests were the most common culprits, ironically the very men tasked with guarding their souls. Confession, that supposedly sacred space where a nun whispered her sins through a screen, too often became the first spark of intimacy. Priests had unparalleled access to nunneries. They entered to say mass, to hear confessions, to offer guidance. And more than once, that guidance led to affairs whispered about in the community, hushed up by the church, but never fully erased from the record. In one 14th century German convent, a visiting priest was discovered living inside the cloister in disguise, sneaking between the cells of several women. When the bishop investigated, he found evidence of bedding rearranged, wine consumed, and pregnancies quietly covered up by sending nuns on retreat until the infants were given away. The scandal rocked the diocese, but the priest was quietly reassigned rather than punished. The nuns, public penance, head shaving, and a lifetime of shame. But it wasn't only priests. Outsiders found ways in too. Pilgrims, merchants, even guards stationed near convents occasionally struck up illicit arrangements. There are accounts of men smuggled into convents, hidden in baskets of food or disguised as workmen. In England, a group of nuns in the 15th century was caught sneaking out through a hidden postern gate at night, meeting lovers in nearby barns and orchards. When they were discovered, their abbess tried to claim they were gathering herbs for medicine. No one believed it. Then there were the relationships inside the convent. When women lived together, slept side by side in dormitories, shared prayers, meals, and secrets, bonds formed, bonds that sometimes crossed into what the church condemned as unholy affection. Letters between nuns survive, filled with tender words and coded language of desire. Inspectors occasionally found pairs of nuns who spent nights together, sparking rumours of physical intimacy. The punishments were harsh: isolation, flogging, or being paraded through the cloister as examples of sin. But the very severity of the punishments tells us just how common these relationships must have been. And then the rumours that veer into the grotesque. Chronicles tell of abbesses accused of running nunneries as brothels, charging wealthy patrons for the company of their sisters. While these stories were often exaggerated by enemies of the church, some of them stick uncomfortably close to the truth. In Spain, inspectors documented frequent violations where noblemen openly visited a convent, hosted banquets, and left with more than just prayers. The human body doesn't bow easily to vows. In a world where women were often forced into nunneries against their will, stripped of choice and locked away from normal life, it's not surprising that some reached for love, lust, or comfort wherever they could find it. The church could punish, shave heads, and threaten damnation, but desire seeped through the cracks of cloister walls like candle smoke. That's the dirty truth you'll never find in the official hagiographies of saintly abbesses. Behind the hymns and prayers, medieval convents pulsed with longing, secrets and scandal, just like the world outside, but with stakes that could ruin a woman's life if she was caught. The medieval convent was not simply a quiet retreat for prayer and hymns. It was a prison of sorts, a place where obedience was enforced not by gentle reminders, but by punishments that could feel as harsh as those given to criminals. The moment a nun strayed too far from her vows, whether through disobedience, desire, or even just laziness, the convent had its own toolkit of discipline, and those punishments were often as cruel as they were humiliating. Let's start with the most common: public shaming. A nun who disobeyed her abbess might be forced to kneel in the cloister during mealtimes, her food withheld while others ate. Sometimes she had to wear a special garment, a coarse wool shift that marked her out as a sinner, while her sisters dined on bread and broth around her. In particularly humiliating cases, a nun might be ordered to lie flat on the cold stone floor, while the others stepped over her on their way to the chapel, a living doormat of disgrace. Then there was physical punishment. Despite their vows of charity and mercy, some abbesses wielded the rod with frightening zeal. Chronicles mention scourges, whips with knotted cords, used to correct disobedient sisters. One German visitation report from the 15th century describes nuns whipped in the refectory until their habits were stained with blood, all for the crime of secretly hoarding food. The justification was always the same: better to suffer pain in the body than to risk eternal damnation in the soul. For more serious offences, confinement was the weapon of choice. Many convents had a small windowless chamber known as the penitential cell. A nun caught in scandal, maybe caught sneaking out at night, or whispering too fondly with a priest, could be locked in there for days or even weeks. Bread and water would be pushed through a small hole, but otherwise she would be left alone with her prayers, the darkness, and her shame. Some never recovered from the psychological toll. Even harsher punishments existed for women accused of carnal sin. If a nun was discovered pregnant, a scandal that happened more often than polite histories admit, she might be paraded in front of the convent community, her head shaved as a mark of disgrace. The infant would be taken away, often left at a monastery or given to a peasant family, while the mother was subjected to lifelong penance. Not every punishment was formal. Sometimes cruelty came from the sisters themselves. Convents were tight-knit, but also tense. Jealousy, suspicion, and resentment brewed easily. A disobedient nun could find herself ostracised, ignored by her sisters, given the worst chores, or denied companionship. Imagine being forced into silence in a world where human contact was your only comfort. That was its own kind of torture. And here's the most grotesque part. Some abbesses were accused of abusing their authority, inventing punishments not to preserve holiness but to enforce personal grudges. There are reports of abbesses forcing troublesome nuns to eat their meals in the latrine, or making them sleep in the freezing cloister without bedding. Whether every story is true or not, the sheer volume of accusations across Europe suggests a pattern of cruelty hidden behind holy walls. The church, for its part, often turned a blind eye. So long as the convent functioned and scandal didn't reach the outside world, punishments were rarely questioned. A nun could suffer years of torment for a mistake, and the only record might be a brief, cold entry in an inspection report. Correction administered. This is the hidden brutality of convent life. While the outside world imagined holy women cloistered in peace, the reality was that many lived in fear of the next humiliation, the next strike of the whip, the next lock of the cell door. Behind the walls, punishment was not just discipline, it was a weapon of control. The convent diet was supposed to reflect purity, plain food, simple meals, nothing to inflame the senses, bread, thin vegetable soups, maybe beans or porridge. That was the standard fare. Meat was often banned outright, except in cases of illness, because it was thought to fuel lust. Fish and eggs were allowed, but even those were rationed carefully. Meals were taken in silence, while one sister read passages from scripture, reminding everyone that food was for survival, not pleasure. But reality rarely matched the ideal. Human beings crave more than thin gruel, and medieval nuns were no exception. The historical record is full of little cracks, where indulgence slipped in, sometimes discreet, sometimes outrageous. Let's start with drink. Wine was technically permitted in small amounts, but small could be stretched. In prosperous convents, particularly in France and Italy, cellars were stocked with barrels of local vintages, and inspectors grumbled about sisters stumbling tipsy to prayers. In Germany, beer often replaced water, since it was safer to drink. But the line between safety and merriment blurred quickly. One visitation report accused a prioress of encouraging her nuns to drink ale beyond the measure of sobriety. Imagine a cloister full of women giggling through Compline, trying to hide their hiccups as the abbess glared. Food smuggling was another open secret. Many convents had kitchens supplied by tenants or wealthy patrons, and cooks could be bribed. Nuns sometimes hoarded delicacies, cheese, sweetmeats, dried fruits, tucked away in their cells. When inspectors came, they found stashes of forbidden treats hidden under straw mattresses or behind crucifixes. In one English convent, a nun was discovered with an entire roast goose in her bed, a gift from a cousin. Her punishment? Public penance after the abbess had eaten the goose herself. Then there were the outright feasts. Convents, especially those connected to noble families, were occasionally visited by relatives bearing gifts. These visits could transform the refectory from a place of silent spoonfuls into a banquet hall. Tables piled with meat pies, spiced cakes, sugared almonds, and pitchers of wine. Chronicles hint at nights where the convent rang with laughter, music, even dancing, indulgence cloaked under the excuse of hospitality. But not all indulgence was joyous. Poverty-stricken convents sometimes resorted to desperate measures. When food was scarce, sisters ate scraps unfit for animals, mouldy bread, rotting vegetables, or watered-down broth. In times of famine, there are accounts of nuns scraping grease from cooking pots or boiling leather scraps to make soup. For these women, indulgence might mean catching a rat in the cellar or sneaking eggs from the chicken coop. And then, of course, there were the whispered accusations that some nuns took indulgence even further. Stories circulate of abbesses who demanded special dishes while their sisters starved, or of convent kitchens where young novices were forced to serve lavish meals to visiting priests. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales reveal the tension between the ideal of holy simplicity and the reality of human appetite. The hypocrisy was glaring. Outside the walls, peasants starved while the church preached poverty. Inside, nuns were sometimes caught feasting like nobles. Inspectors lamented that the sisters grow fat on forbidden foods, while the poor beg at the gates. But little changed. Food was both a comfort and a rebellion, a way for women trapped in a cloister to taste a fleeting bit of pleasure, even if it meant risking shame or punishment. So while the world imagined convents filled with pale, thin ascetics nibbling bread in silence, the truth was far messier. Between drunken laughter, smuggled sweets, and the occasional goose in a bed, nuns revealed themselves to be human after all, hungry, thirsty, and eager to break the rules when the chance arose. Convents in medieval Europe weren't just religious sanctuaries, they were economic engines. To survive, they needed land, tenants, labour, and above all, money. And money, as always, corrupted. Behind the whitewashed walls and daily prayers, convents often operated more like businesses than houses of God, and the women inside had to navigate a world of finances, politics, and sometimes outright fraud. The first thing to know is that convents collected dowries. Families who wanted to send their daughters into religious life had to pay hefty sums, sometimes enough to bankrupt a peasant household or weigh heavily even on the nobility. A girl without a dowry was rarely admitted unless she was taken as a servant, condemned to scrub floors while the wealthier brides of Christ enjoyed the privileges of status. It turned the convent into a kind of marketplace, where only those who could pay gained entry into the spiritual elite. Dowries weren't just symbolic offerings, they were investments. Families expected their daughter's convent to pray for them, protect their reputation, and maybe even provide influence in local politics. A wealthy abbess with well-born nuns could sway the opinion of bishops or curry favour with kings. Money meant leverage, and leverage often meant bending rules. Then there were the land holdings. Convents owned farms, orchards and vineyards, worked by peasants who paid rent in crops or labour. Some abbesses became ruthless landlords. Documents accused them of hiking rents, seizing livestock, and even throwing families off their land when payments lagged. In other cases, convents hired stewards who acted more like thugs, squeezing every last coin from desperate tenants while the sisters inside recited psalms of mercy. But perhaps the dirtiest secret was embezzlement. Many convents received generous donations: silver chalices, fine fabrics, barrels of wine, even relics of saints. Inspectors' reports reveal how easily these treasures disappeared. Abbesses were accused of pawning convent property to fund personal luxuries, from fur-lined habits to imported delicacies. In one notorious case from the 14th century Spain, a prioress was charged with running her convent coffers dry while secretly funding a lover's lavish lifestyle. Not all corruption was financial. Some convents became political pawns. Noble families installed their daughters as abbesses to secure control over church lands. These women sometimes behaved less like spiritual leaders and more like feudal lords, wielding power with an iron fist. Rivalries between convents led to feuds, lawsuits, and even fistfights in churchyards. Imagine women in habits hurling insults across a cloister because one abbess accused another of stealing grazing rights for her cattle. And of course, money and power opened the door to moral corruption. Priests and bishops who oversaw convents often turned a blind eye to abuses, as long as the gold kept flowing. Wealthier convents could buy forgiveness through donations, while poorer houses faced constant scrutiny and condemnation. This created a two-tier system where piety mattered far less than silver. For the average nun, this meant living in a community where vows of poverty were preached but rarely practiced. Some sisters wore patched habits and went hungry, while others, daughters of nobles with fat dowries, dined on venison and dressed in fine wool under their veils. Resentment brewed. Chronicles record bitter divisions between choir nuns, who prayed and studied, and lay sisters, who worked in kitchens and fields. Money, once again, created class. Perhaps the most shocking part: even when corruption was exposed, punishment was rare. The church hierarchy often preferred to hush scandals rather than risk shaking public faith. Documents were quietly buried, abbesses quietly transferred, and life continued. So much for holy poverty. Medieval convents were supposed to embody spiritual simplicity, but in truth, they reflected the same greed, ambition, and inequality that plagued the outside world. Money wasn't just present in the cloister, it ruled it. If you believe the church's official story, nuns lived in perfect chastity, sealed away from temptation. But humans don't leave their desires behind just because they pass through a convent gate, and priests, monks, and laymen didn't stop being tempted simply because the women on the other side of the cloister wall wore veils. The result? Centuries of whispered stories, scandalous court cases, and shocking confessions that reveal convents were never as pure as sermons claimed. Priests were supposed to be guardians of these women's souls. In reality, many became their lovers. Priests visited convents to hear confessions or celebrate Mass, and intimacy often grew in the shadows of these meetings. Some nuns confessed to falling in love with their confessor, turning sacred encounters into dangerous flirtations. Inquisition records mention priests caught sneaking into convent dormitories under cover of darkness, or disguising themselves to slip past gates. Monks from nearby monasteries were another common thread. Convents and monasteries often collaborated, sharing land and labour. That meant monks and nuns saw more of each other than rules allowed. In one notorious 15th century case, a group of Benedictine nuns and monks were found holding late-night feasts together, with food, drink, and plenty of activities that had nothing to do with prayer. The scandal rocked the region, but everyone survived with only token punishments, proof of how deep corruption ran. It wasn't always men of the cloth. Ordinary laymen, servants, builders, or gardeners sometimes became entangled with nuns. Convents hired men for heavy labour, repairing roofs, tending fields, digging wells. These workers were supposed to stay under constant supervision. But walls have corners, cloisters have shadows, and temptation is hard to police. There are cases of gardeners who fathered children inside convents, and blacksmiths who were accused of keeping long-term affairs with prioresses. The sheer scale of these relationships is staggering. Church visitations across Europe routinely mention carnal lapses within convents. Some records describe entire communities where chastity had all but collapsed. Inspectors lamented that certain convents resembled brothels more than holy houses. In one case, a bishop wrote bitterly that the nuns in his diocese loved priests more than Christ. The consequences for discovery were uneven. A poor nun caught with a lover might be whipped, imprisoned in her cell, or even expelled. Wealthier nuns with powerful families usually faced lighter punishment. Priests involved in these scandals often got away with little more than reassignment. It wasn't fairness, it was politics. What about children? That was the most damning proof of all. Pregnancies inside convents did happen, though they were often hushed up. Sometimes newborns were quietly abandoned, placed at convent doors as though they'd been left by outsiders. Other times, infants were smuggled out to sympathetic relatives or fostered in secret. The Church's silence on these cases was deliberate. Acknowledging them would undermine its entire image of moral authority. And there's an even darker side. Sometimes relationships weren't consensual. Priests and monks held immense power over cloistered women, and abuse was hidden under the guise of spiritual guidance. Medieval chronicles hint at nuns who endured coercion in silence, trapped between their vows and their vulnerability. For them, the convent wasn't protection, it was a prison. The contradiction is stark. The convent, meant to be a fortress of purity, often became a hotbed of forbidden intimacy. Some of these relationships were tender, even loving. Others were exploitative, corrupt, or abusive. But all reveal the same truth. No wall, no veil, no vow could erase human desire. When forbidden relationships in nunneries came to light, the Church faced a problem. Publicly, it needed to appear strict to show the world that sin inside holy walls would not be tolerated. But privately, cover-ups were the rule of the day. The Church depended on convents for money, land, and prestige. A full-blown scandal could ruin reputations, cost noble families their honour, and expose the hypocrisy of the clergy. So punishment was often more about appearances than justice. Let's start with the punishments for nuns. The most common penalty was isolation. A nun discovered with a lover might be locked in her cell for weeks or months, forced to survive on bread and water. Others were made to confess publicly before their sisters, humiliated in front of the very community where secrecy had once protected them. The harsher cases involved whipping, usually delivered by another nun as part of discipline. Medieval records are filled with euphemisms like chastisement or correction, but the reality was physical pain meant to scare others into obedience. Expulsion was another punishment, but only for the powerless. A poor nun without family connections could be thrown out of the convent and left to fend for herself. That was practically a death sentence. Once branded a failed bride of Christ, there was little chance of marriage, employment, or survival. For wealthy nuns, the story was different. If a prioress or abbess was caught in a scandal, her family often intervened. Dowries weren't just spiritual gifts, they were financial investments, and noble families weren't about to lose face. More often than not, elite nuns were quietly transferred to another convent, their sins buried with them. Priests and monks caught in these affairs faced equally inconsistent punishments. Officially, they were supposed to be defrocked, removed from office, and excommunicated. In reality, most were simply reassigned. A bishop might scold them, then pack them off to another parish where their behaviour was someone else's problem. It was easier to shuffle priests around than to admit widespread corruption. This tactic would become infamous centuries later during other scandals, but it was already a standard practice in the Middle Ages. And then there were the cover-ups. When convent scandals risked spilling into public view, church authorities scrambled to contain the damage. Sometimes visitations, official inspections of convents, were carefully edited before being sent to higher offices. Inspectors might record a shocking immorality in their private notes, then file a clean version for Rome. Other times, whole communities were bribed into silence. Wealthy convents could afford to pay bishops for leniency, buying forgiveness in coin rather than prayers. Occasionally, scandals broke wide open anyway. Chronicles tell of towns buzzing with gossip after a nun gave birth, or after priests were caught sneaking into cloisters at night. In these cases, the church often tried to spin the story. Pregnancies were blamed on demons. Affairs were written off as isolated lapses, never part of a larger pattern. Ordinary people weren't always convinced, of course, but public shame was enough to keep most silent. The darker truth is that punishments were rarely about justice. They were about control. Nuns who threatened the church's reputation were punished severely. Not necessarily because their sins were worse, but because they endangered the institution. Meanwhile, powerful figures could sin openly and still escape with little more than a slap on the wrist. So, whenever you picture the medieval convent as a fortress of purity, remember this: for every scandal punished, 10 more were hidden. Behind locked gates and whitewashed walls, corruption was managed, not erased. When most people picture medieval nunneries, they imagine endless hours of prayer, hymns echoing in stone chapels, and pious women with eyes fixed on heaven. But reality often strayed into something stranger. Behind convent walls, alongside devotion, there thrived an underworld of superstition, ritual, and even occult practices that the church tried desperately to keep quiet. Let's start with healing charms. Nuns were often the healers of their communities, mixing herbs, tending the sick, and preparing remedies. On the surface, this was holy work, but healing often bled into superstition. Many convent recipes included whispered prayers, strange incantations, or symbolic gestures borrowed from folk magic. Some nuns swore by amulets, bits of parchment inscribed with psalms, sewn into cloth and worn under the habit for protection. Others kept relics not sanctioned by the church at all: bones of animals, dried frogs, even stones they believed had mystical power. Then came visions and trances. Mystical experiences were prized, but not all of them looked like the serene ecstasies painted in church art. Some convents reported outbreaks of possession, with nuns falling into wild convulsions, screaming in tongues, or claiming demons tormented them in the night. Was it illness, mass hysteria, or something darker? To outsiders, these episodes often looked like madness. To the nuns inside, they could be both terrifying and strangely intoxicating. And yes, there were whispers of outright witchcraft. In a few documented cases, inquisitors accused nuns of summoning spirits, casting love charms, or even attempting to call up the devil himself. One 15th century trial describes a convent where several nuns were said to meet secretly at night, drawing circles, chanting, and burning herbs that filled the air with heavy smoke. Whether they truly believed in sorcery or simply played with the forbidden, the effect was the same. Scandal, superstition wasn't always sinister. Some rituals were almost playful. Nuns anxious about their future might use divination tricks, melting wax into water to see shapes, or dropping needles into bowls to predict outcomes. Others borrowed customs from local villages, believing certain plants picked at dawn on Midsummer's Day would ensure health or fertility. These practices blurred the line between faith and folklore, creating a hybrid spirituality the church tolerated only when it stayed hidden. Why did these things thrive in nunneries? Part of it was isolation. Cut off from the world, with endless hours of silence, imaginations ran wild. Dreams and visions felt like messages. Whispers in the dormitory turned into rituals in the cloister. And part of it was power. In a world where women had so little agency, the idea of controlling fate through charms or hidden prayers gave nuns a secret sense of strength. Of course, when these practices came to light, the church cracked down hard. Inquisitors warned that convents could become nests of heresy if superstition went unchecked. Nuns accused of occult rituals were interrogated, shamed, and sometimes even executed as witches. But for every exposed case, countless others remained hidden in the shadows of candlelit chapels and locked dormitories. The convent wasn't just a house of prayer. It was also a crucible where faith, fear, and forbidden desires mingled. Behind the chants and psalms, there were secret rituals that blurred into heresy. And for many nuns, this wasn't rebellion. It was survival, a way to feel a sense of control in a life stripped of freedom. At first glance, the daily rhythm of a medieval convent seems predictable, even monotonous. The bells rang before dawn, summoning nuns to matins, the first prayer of the day. Then came lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and finally compline before bed. Prayer framed every waking hour, and for outsiders, that was the end of the story. Endless devotion. But beneath this official order lay a more complex, more human reality. The day began in cold dormitories, where rows of straw mattresses lined the walls. Nuns woke in the dark, slipping into habits stiff with age and smell. They filed into the chapel, voices rising in chant. But not every nun's thoughts were on God. Some were distracted by hunger, others by fatigue, and a few by memories of the world they'd left behind. The official record makes it sound as though they prayed like angels. The truth is, many nodded off, whispered to each other, or simply mouthed the words. After prayers came work. Convents were not passive havens, they were engines of labour. Nuns spun wool, wove cloth, copied manuscripts, baked bread, brewed ale, and tended gardens. Many were skilled in medicine, growing herbs and tending to villagers who sought healing. Others ran schools for young girls, teaching reading, writing, and embroidery. Work was framed as devotion, but it also brought in income. The reality: the more profitable the labour, the more pressure on nuns to produce. This often meant long hours at the loom or in the fields, with hands blistered and backs aching. And then there was the hidden life. Officially, nuns were to renounce worldly pleasures. No rich food, no luxuries, no indulgence. In practice, rules bent. Wealthy convents feasted on roasted meats and imported wine. Some nuns hoarded small treasures in their cells, jewellery tucked under straw, perfumes smuggled from merchants, even mirrors. Visitors, especially noble families, often brought gifts, and abbesses looked the other way, when those gifts became personal possessions. Even stricter convents had their secrets. Forbidden romances left traces in letters smuggled under doorways. Priests brought more than communion. Sometimes they brought intimacy. Some nuns shared deep bonds with each other, relationships the church labelled as sin, but which provided comfort in a world of cold stone walls and endless prayers. Leisure also crept in. Chronicles describe nuns playing board games, telling jokes, and even sneaking into orchards to steal fruit. Some sang secular songs or told bawdy stories when superiors weren't listening. And in winter, when days were short and candles expensive, evenings often filled with whispered conversations in the dark. These weren't the lives of saints frozen in stained glass, but of women carving out small joys where they could. Yet daily life wasn't free of danger. Malnutrition was common in poorer convents. Outbreaks of plague or dysentery could sweep through enclosed communities, killing dozens in weeks. Punishments for breaking rules, fasting, beatings, or public humiliation kept discipline sharp. The balance was fragile, outwardly devoted to God, inwardly wrestling with boredom, longing, and rebellion. What makes convent life so fascinating is the gap between the image and the truth. Officially, nuns lived lives of pure devotion, untouched by worldly temptation. In reality, their days were a mix of prayer and pragmatism, discipline and indulgence, secrecy and scandal. They prayed, yes, but they also laughed, fought, schemed, indulged and sinned, all within the same stone walls. So the next time you picture a medieval nun bent over her prayer book, remember that she might have been dreaming of roast goose, hiding a love letter under her mattress, or stifling a laugh at a whispered joke in the choir stalls. Daily life in a convent wasn't just holy, it was achingly human. Not all nunneries were created equal. In fact, the gap between a wealthy convent and a poor one could feel like the difference between a palace and a prison. This divide didn't just shape comfort, it shaped reputation, behaviour, and the very scandals that medieval gossip loved to whisper about. Let's start at the wealthy end. Elite convents often received donations from noble families who placed their daughters inside. These houses sat on lands, collected rents, and sometimes controlled entire villages. They had stone buildings with glass windows, orchards, fish ponds, and even private chapels decorated with gold leaf. The nuns inside could eat meat regularly, drink imported wines, and sleep on feather mattresses. Some abbesses lived like aristocrats, wearing fine linen under their habits, and corresponding with kings or bishops as near equals. These convents became status refuges. Wealthy families often placed spare daughters there, those who didn't marry, or those whose dowries were too small for a desirable match. But being in a convent didn't always mean renouncing luxury. Letters reveal that some elite nuns kept servants, used cosmetics, and accepted expensive gifts from relatives. Instead of poverty and chastity, these houses sometimes became centres of intrigue, where ambitious women wielded power under the cover of piety. On the other side were the poor convents, and they were a different world. Crumbling walls, draughty dormitories, and perpetual hunger defined daily life. These convents relied on alms and the labour of nuns themselves. Meals were meagre, coarse bread, watery pottage, maybe a bit of cheese if they were lucky. Winters were brutal, with inadequate clothing and little firewood. Nuns slept on straw sacks that attracted vermin, and outbreaks of disease tore through with grim regularity. In these poorer houses, rules often bent for survival. Some nuns went begging in towns, disguising themselves to avoid shame. Others turned to less holy methods, stealing brewing ale in secret, or even selling charms and potions to peasants. Chroniclers and church officials sometimes accused the poorest convents of sliding into outright scandal. Nuns sneaking out at night, consorting with men, or renting convent land to taverns and brothels. The divide created resentment. Poor convents envied rich ones. Rich convents looked down on poor ones. Wealthy abbesses sometimes tightened rules, publicly condemning the loose behaviour of poorer houses, while secretly indulging in their own luxuries. Meanwhile, poor convents whispered that the elites had abandoned true devotion in favour of feasting and finery. Scandals often emerged right where wealth and poverty collided. Wealthy convents were accused of hypocrisy, abbesses dining on silver plates while preaching humility. Poor convents were accused of vice, nuns turning to prostitution when hunger became unbearable. The truth was messy, but both extremes exposed how far real life strayed from the church's ideal of cloistered purity. One telling story comes from 14th century France, where inspectors found a convent where the abbess had installed a private chamber with silk hangings and a feather bed, while her sisters froze in bare cells. Another report described a convent in Germany so impoverished that the nuns regularly slipped out to nearby towns to earn food and money in ways the church would never admit publicly. Both stories shocked outsiders, but they weren't rare. The nunneries of medieval Europe weren't a uniform world of identical devotion. They reflected the same inequalities, temptations, and hypocrisies as the society around them. Some resembled aristocratic courts in miniature, others were closer to workhouses, and in both, the cracks in the image of holy purity gave way to secrets that outsiders barely imagined. Of all the shadows that clung to medieval nunneries, none stirred more scandal than the subject of forbidden love. The official story was clear. Nuns vowed chastity, cut off from the world of flesh, married only to Christ. But the reality, whispered in chronicles and exposed in ecclesiastical investigations, told a different tale, one of passion, secrecy, and shocking affairs that rattled the image of cloistered virtue. Let's start with the most obvious danger: the priests. Every convent needed male clergy to perform mass, hear confessions, and administer sacraments. That meant regular contact with men of authority, and proximity bred temptation. There are countless accounts of nuns falling in love, with their confessors exchanging furtive letters or arranging secret trysts. In 14th century England, one bishop complained of undue familiarity between priests and nuns, noting that many convents had become dens of scandal. His words weren't exaggeration. Some priests treated nunneries like harems. But priests weren't the only men in the picture. Wealthy patrons, laity, nobles who funded convents, also gained access. A generous landowner might stop by to check on his nuns, and gifts sometimes carried expectations. One notorious case in Italy described a convent where several nuns bore children, widely believed to be fathered by a local baron who visited regularly under the guise of patronage. When inspectors arrived, the abbess tried to hide the infants in the kitchens, but the truth spilled out. Then there were outsiders who risked everything. In towns, rumours spread of nuns slipping out in disguise to meet lovers. Chroniclers mention nighttime escapades through back gates, secret tunnels, or bribed guards. In Paris, one convent was investigated after neighbours complained of nocturnal singing and laughter that didn't sound like psalms. What they heard, in fact, were clandestine gatherings where men joined the sisters for wine, song, and far less holy diversions. Inside the walls, love between the nuns themselves was another secret rarely spoken aloud. Church officials railed against unnatural affections, but in enclosed all-female communities, emotional bonds often grew intense. Some were innocent friendships, others crossed into romance. Surviving letters, rare but revealing, showed deep passion between women who called each other beloved and wrote of kisses and longing. For many, these relationships provided comfort in a life stripped of family and choice. To churchmen, they were mortal sins. To the nuns, they were survival. The church's response varied. Sometimes scandals were hushed up to avoid damaging reputations. Other times, punishment was harsh. Nuns caught in affairs might be locked in solitary cells, flogged, or even expelled. But repression only fueled secrecy. Human desire doesn't vanish behind stone walls, it adapts. One of the most shocking reports came from Germany in the 15th century, where inspectors discovered that a convent had become so notorious for affairs with priests that locals nicknamed it the brothel of the Holy Virgins. Yet instead of shutting it down, the church quietly reassigned clergy and replaced the abbess, fearing public scandal more than sin itself. All of this leaves us with a raw truth. Nunneries were never the sterile sanctuaries of pure devotion that legend suggests. They were places of real women, wrestling with loneliness, desire, and forbidden love. And whether it was a whispered note passed under a chapel door, a nighttime escape, or a secret child hidden in the laundry room, those forbidden loves left a trail of stories too human and too scandalous for official histories to erase. Where there is temptation, there is punishment. Medieval nunneries didn't only house women who longed for freedom. They also created systems to control and discipline those who strayed. And when a nun was caught breaking her vows, the results could be harsh, humiliating, and sometimes downright terrifying. Punishment began with public shaming. A sister who disobeyed rules, whether by sneaking out, speaking back to the abbess, or being suspected of indecency, might be forced to confess her sin in front of the entire community. Imagine kneeling on the cold floor, the weight of dozens of eyes burning into you while you recited your offence aloud. The abbess could impose penances ranging from fasting on bread and water to wearing coarse sackcloth instead of a habit. It wasn't just about repentance, it was about stripping away dignity. For more serious cases, punishment turned physical. Surviving records describe whippings, often done in the chapter house, with other nuns forced to watch. A wayward sister might be beaten with rods or leather straps, the blows justified as corrections for the soul. Inspectors sometimes recommended even harsher measures. A nun could be locked in a cell for weeks, fed only scraps, or forced to sleep on the bare ground with no blanket. But it wasn't always official punishments that left the deepest scars. In some convents, discipline turned into bullying. Abbesses and senior nuns, wielding authority, could make life miserable for those they disliked. Stories survive of younger nuns being worked nearly to death in the kitchens, or ordered to scrub floors endlessly while their peers studied scripture. A disobedient nun might be ostracised, denied companionship, or left to eat alone in silence. And then there were the punishments, tied to scandals of the flesh. A nun caught with a lover, whether male or female, faced the worst consequences. In England, inspectors recorded cases where pregnant nuns were locked away until childbirth, the infants secretly disposed of, and the women confined for life. In other places, offenders were expelled, their names smeared across church records. But sometimes convents handled it quietly, hiding the evidence to protect their reputation. A fallen sister might simply disappear, transferred to another house, or quietly retired into isolation. Yet even in punishment, hypocrisy reigned. Wealthy nuns could often escape the worst. A noble-born sister caught in an affair might receive a slap on the wrist, while a poor novice was whipped and branded a disgrace. Records show abbesses bending rules to protect their friends and patrons while crushing those with no family power. Discipline was as much about politics as it was about sin. What strikes us today is how much of this punishment fed into the very scandals it tried to suppress. Locking nuns into solitary cells didn't erase desire, it created bitterness. Whipping women in public didn't cleanse their souls, it humiliated them in front of the only family they had left. By trying to control every aspect of their lives, convents often magnified the tension simmering within their walls. The church wanted nunneries to be symbols of purity and discipline. But the reality was a cycle: temptation, scandal, punishment, and then the whole thing repeating itself. The walls closed in, but they couldn't fully contain the humanity inside. And sometimes those walls only made the secrets darker. To really understand what happened inside medieval nunneries, you have to remember this: they weren't just places of prayer. They were political tools shaped by power, money, and the ambitions of families who treated convents like chessboards. And the nuns themselves, often pawns in a game they never agreed to play. For noble families, sending a daughter into a convent wasn't always about piety. Sometimes it was about inheritance. If a wealthy man had too many daughters, marrying them all off with dowries could ruin him financially. The solution: send one or two into the convent, where the dowry was smaller, and the daughter was neatly removed from the competition for land and property. A cloistered daughter meant the family estate stayed intact. Other times, convents were used to neutralise scandal. If a young woman dishonoured her family by falling pregnant, flirting with the wrong man, or simply being inconvenient, the convent was a convenient dumping ground. Chronicles tell of women arriving unwillingly, sometimes even dragged there under guard. Some never adjusted, living the rest of their lives as prisoners dressed in habits. Abbesses themselves could be deeply political figures. Some ran their convents like fiefdoms, negotiating with kings, bishops and landowners. In Germany, powerful abbesses controlled vast estates, acting almost like queens in miniature. Yet this power often came with strings. Families pulled favours to get their daughters named prioress or abbess, creating webs of nepotism. For every holy leader, there was another who was simply a political appointee. And then there were the convents that functioned as holding pens for inconvenient women of power. Queens, princesses and noble widows sometimes ended up in nunneries as a way to remove them from politics. Eleanor of Aquitaine famously placed her rebellious daughter in a convent to tame her. In other cases, defeated rivals were shoved into the cloister to keep them from causing trouble. What did this mean for daily life inside the walls? It meant some nunneries weren't filled with eager brides of Christ, but with women who resented being there. Tensions brewed between noble-born sisters who expected privileges and poorer women who actually joined out of devotion. Rivalries flared, cliques formed, and politics seeped into everything, from meal times to the chanting of psalms. The politics didn't stop at the gates. Convents were often deeply entangled with the world outside. They leased land, collected rents, and even employed servants. This meant constant dealings with men, stewards, tenants, bishops, patrons, which opened the door to corruption and scandal. Bribes could buy lighter rules or more freedom. Wealthy patrons might expect more, intimate returns for their generosity, All of this undercuts the image of convents as serene havens of prayer. Instead, many were arenas of power, where money and influence mattered as much as scripture. And for the women inside, that meant their bodies, reputations, and futures were tied not just to faith, but to the ruthless games of politics being played in the world beyond their cloister walls. Behind every hymn and every candlelit chapel was the reality that these convents were as political as any royal court. Only their scandals were easier to bury. When most people picture a medieval convent, they imagine a place of poverty and simplicity. Women in plain habits, eating meagre meals, praying for the salvation of their souls. But that wasn't always the truth. In fact, some nunneries became notorious for their wealth, corruption, and the shady dealings that kept their coffers full. Let's start with money itself. Convents owned land, sometimes huge amounts of it. They collected rents from peasants, tolls from markets, even tithes from local villages. An abbess with good political connections could grow as rich as any nobleman. And while some abbesses were strict guardians of their convent's wealth, others lived in quiet luxury behind the walls. Records show convents with kitchens stocked with spices, imported wines, fine linens, and jewellery, even though vows of poverty were supposed to forbid such indulgence. This led to financial scandals. In 13th century France, bishops complained about abbacies mismanaging funds, selling off church property, or embezzling rents. Inspectors sometimes found convents that looked more like noble courts than houses of prayer. Instead of silence and discipline, there were banquets, feasts, and music. And if the convent was wealthy enough, servants did most of the work, while the sisters enjoyed the benefits. Of course, money often went hand in hand with corruption of the flesh. Wealthy patrons donated generously, but some expected favours in return. There are letters and complaints from bishops warning abbesses to keep men from staying overnight, which hints at what was really going on. Some convents became infamous in their regions, whispered about as places where celibacy was little more than a costume. And then there's the evidence from wills and donations. Wealthy men often left money to convent, not only for the salvation of their souls, but sometimes for suspiciously personal reasons. Some documents suggest these men had close relationships with certain nuns. Think of it. A donor gives money to ensure special prayers are said for him, but perhaps also to ensure his lover behind the convent walls lives comfortably. Not all corruption was sexual, though. Sometimes it was sheer financial scheming. Abbesses might gamble on risky loans, extort tenants, or divert convent funds to their own families. Inspectors recorded cases where abbesses essentially bankrolled their relatives with church wealth. Some convents even ran businesses, renting out property to taverns or breweries, and in rare cases, letting out land to brothels. Imagine that irony, a convent profiting off the very sin it claimed to resist. But the darker side was how this wealth divided the women inside. Class mattered. Noble-born nuns often ate better food, wore finer habits, and had softer beds, while poorer sisters slept on straw and worked in the kitchens. In some convents, inequality grew so sharp that revolts broke out. There are records of nuns complaining to bishops that their abbess favoured a select circle while the rest suffered. It's tempting to think of medieval convents as innocent sanctuaries. The reality? They were businesses as much as religious institutions. And like any business of the Middle Ages, they were prone to corruption, greed, and scandal. By the 15th century, some convents had such bad reputations that reformers called them houses of ill repute in disguise. That's how blurred the line had become. These weren't just places of prayer. They were microcosms of all the flaws of medieval society: greed, lust, politics, and hypocrisy hidden under a thin layer of piety. Every cloister wall was meant to be a barrier, a physical line between the sacred life inside and the sinful world outside. But as every medieval chronicler knew, walls don't stop feelings. And some of the most whispered stories of medieval nunneries are about forbidden love, dangerous, reckless, and often tragic. Take the story of Heloise and Abelard in 12th century Paris. While not confined to a convent at first, Heloise was eventually sent to one after their love affair was discovered. Abelard, a brilliant philosopher, and Heloise, his equally brilliant pupil, began a passionate relationship that scandalised the city. When her uncle found out, Abelard was brutally punished, and Heloise was forced into a convent life she never wanted. Their letters, preserved to this day, reveal the torment of a woman caught between passion and vows. God knows, Heloise once wrote, "I would rather be your whore than a queen." That kind of raw honesty explodes the myth that nuns were always content with celibacy. Other stories are less poetic and far more scandalous. In 14th century Italy, records accuse some convents of allowing men to sneak in disguised as workmen or priests. Local gossip told of secret tunnels connecting abbeys to nearby monasteries, making night visits a little too convenient. Whether those tunnels were real or just products of imagination, the fact that people believed them tells you how common these rumours were. There are also accounts of priests and bishops themselves taking advantage of nuns. One bishop in Germany was accused of fathering multiple children with sisters in his jurisdiction. Church officials often hush such scandals, fearing public shame. Babies born in convents were sometimes abandoned at the gates or quietly handed off to foundling hospitals, their mothers returning to the choir stalls as if nothing had happened. But not all forbidden love came from outside the convent. Chronicles hint at relationships between the women themselves. Some reformers scolded nuns for forming particular friendships, which was a code phrase for intimacy between two sisters. Letters from visitations include stern warnings. No two women should sleep in the same bed. No one should spend too much time with just one friend. If the rules sound oddly specific, it's because they were written to prevent behaviours that were already happening. And sometimes the stories mix love with politics. In noble convents, rivalries between sisters could spark dangerous alliances. An abbess might look the other way if a favoured nun was meeting a lover, while harshly punishing another for the same act. Those who played the game carefully could enjoy freedoms others didn't dare risk. What makes these stories powerful isn't just the scandal, but the very human longing behind them. Behind the chants and the habits were young women who never chose the convent, who had memories of the world outside, its colours, its music, its men. Even for those who embraced the cloister, temptation was constant. It might come in the form of a travelling minstrel song drifting through the convent walls, or the fleeting touch of another sister's hand during prayer. And when that longing boiled over, it created some of the most shocking, hidden stories of the Middle Ages. Stories the Church desperately tried to bury. But history, of course, remembers. So, what do we make of it all? For centuries, convents were painted as places of purity, sanctity, and spiritual devotion. Yet when you peel back the layers of hymns and stone walls, you find something much messier. Deeply human stories of desire, corruption, survival, and rebellion. Medieval nunneries weren't just houses of prayer, they were microcosms of medieval society itself. Inside the cloister, you found the same contradictions you'd see in any castle, tavern, or town square. Women struggling for power, women trapped by circumstance, women bending rules to survive, and women punished for stepping too far out of line. The legacy of these nunneries is complicated. On one hand, they preserved knowledge, ran hospitals, educated girls, and gave women a degree of autonomy they couldn't find in marriage. On the other, they were riddled with hypocrisy. Vows of chastity often sat alongside whispered affairs. Poverty vows were mocked by wealthy abbesses dining on spiced wine. Obedience sometimes crumbled into rebellion when the walls closed in too tightly. What's most striking is how much of this history was deliberately hidden. Chroniclers and bishops worked hard to silence the scandals, to burn the evidence, to make sure the image of the cloister stayed spotless. But fragments survived. Inspection records, letters, court cases, rumours too juicy to erase. And from those fragments, we glimpse the truth. It's not the picture you'd expect. It's more human, more raw, and yes, more shocking. Behind the chants of Ave Maria were whispered secrets. Behind the iron gates were love stories, betrayals, and sins that mirrored the very world the cloister tried to escape. So next time you walk past the ruins of a medieval abbey, or flip through a book that praises the piety of the cloister, remember what the walls really held. Not just saints, not just sinners, but women, real flesh and blood women, navigating a life that was far more complex, messy, and fascinating than the clean lines of church history suggest. And maybe that's the real lesson, that even in the most sacred spaces of the Middle Ages, humanity always found a way to spill through,